I've been hauling cargo through the belt long enough to know that every job that sounds simple is the one that kills you. The complicated ones, the ones with too many moving parts, too many handshakes, too many stops between here and payday, those are the ones you walk away from. Or at least, that's the rule I had. I broke it on Ceres, in a saloon that smelled like engine grease and recycled air, with a cat under my arm and nothing in my pockets but a name and a destination. The cat's name was Monkeypuss. Don't ask me why. I didn't name him. I was just the delivery man. Some outfit on the inner belt wanted a live animal brought to a place called Eddie's, which sat at the bottom of a crater on Ceres like a rotten tooth in a jawbone. The kind of establishment where the lights are dim because nobody wants to see what they're drinking, and the music comes from a speaker wired to a generator that coughs every 30 seconds. I'd been there before. Years back, when I was younger and dumber, and still thought the solar system had something to offer besides distance. I walked in with the cat and the whole place turned to look at me. Not because I was interesting, I wasn't. It was the cat. A live animal, breathing and warm, fur and whiskers and a heartbeat. Half the men in that bar hadn't seen a living thing that wasn't human in years. One old man at the end of the counter actually stood up from his stool, mouth open, and started telling a joke about a man walking into a bar, except he told the punchline first and then spent 3 minutes trying to work his way back to the setup. He never got there. That was the kind of place Eddie's was. On the way to the bar, I passed 2 men in grease-stained overalls who blocked the corridor and performed what I can only describe as an aggressive shuffle, some kind of dance or challenge or greeting. They stomped and swayed in the narrow hallway, their boots ringing on the metal grating, and I stood there with a cat under my arm waiting for them to finish. They did. They nodded at me. I nodded back. That was the social contract on Ceres. You let a man dance in your way, and he lets you pass. Eddie inspected the cat the way you'd inspect a used engine part, turning it over, checking the teeth, holding it up to the light. He seemed satisfied. He slid something across the bar to me. A box, heavy for its size, warm to the touch, humming faintly. "What is it?" I asked. "A cloning device," Eddie said. "Already running, should be done in a few weeks." "Cloning what?" Eddie looked at me like I was the dumbest man in the system. "A girl," he said. "A real live girl." I should have left the box on the bar. I should have walked out, climbed back into my ship, and pointed it toward Earth. But I didn't, because that's when I heard a voice behind me that I hadn't heard in 6 years. "Curtis, you son of a bitch." Lawrence, the blueberry pirate. He was sitting in the back corner with a glass of something brown, grinning at me with that gap-toothed smile that had gotten us into and out of more trouble than I cared to remember. We'd worked together back in the day, hauling, trading, stealing fruit from the agricultural stations when the pay dried up. Lawrence had a gift for theft and a weakness for plans that sounded brilliant at 2 in the morning and suicidal by dawn. He looked older. We all did out here. The system aged you in dog years. "Sit down," he said. "I've got a proposition." I sat, he talked, and the plan, as plans go, was exactly the kind I should have walked away from. Here's what Lawrence laid out. The cloning device in the box was growing a genuine human female. Out here, past the inner planets, that was rarer than water on Mercury. The mining colonies on Jupiter hadn't seen a woman in 2 generations. The men there worked the deep shafts, pulled ore, and lived in barracks that smelled like sweat and sulfur. Their entire social order revolved around one individual, a young man they called the boy who actually saw a woman's breast. He was their royalty, their celebrity, their living proof that women existed somewhere in the universe. They paraded him out for the workers like a religious icon. His name carried weight. Lawrence's idea was simple in the way that a house fire is simple. Take the clone to Jupiter. Trade her to Lee Violensky, the man who ran the mining operation, in exchange for the boy. Then take the boy to Venus, where the population was entirely female and in need of a new stud king, their old one, a man named Johnny R., having recently died in service. Trade the boy for Johnny R.'s remains. then haul Johnny R's body back to Earth, where his family was offering a substantial reward for the return of their wayward son. 4 stops, 3 trades, 1 payday. And what do you get out of it? I asked Lawrence. He shrugged. I get to say I pulled it off. That was Lawrence, always chasing the story more than the money. I should have said no. I was going to say no. But then Lawrence leaned forward and told me how much Johnny R's family was paying, and the number had enough zeros on it to make my ship feel very small and my future feel very short, and I heard myself say yes. We shook on it. Lawrence ordered another round, and then the door opened and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Professor Hess walked in like he owned the place. Tall, thin, wearing a coat that was too clean for Ceres. He had a face like a hatchet and eyes that moved too fast, cataloging everything, the exits, the patrons, the weapons. He saw me and smiled. It was not a good smile. "Samuel Curtis," he said, "it's my birthday." I hadn't seen Hess in years. We'd been friends once or something close to it. Then something went wrong between us, I'm still not entirely sure what, and he'd spent the years since nursing a grudge that had curdled into something I didn't have a word for. Obsession, maybe, or hunger. He didn't just want to kill me. He wanted me to forgive him first. For what, I never figured out. That was the thing about Hess. He operated on a logic that looked human from a distance, but fell apart the closer you got. He had a weapon, a small thing, barely bigger than a penlight, but I'd heard what it did. It didn't burn you or shoot you. It reduced you to ash, just a little pile of gray powder on the floor where a person used to be. Hess had left a trail of those piles across the system, and every one of them had been someone who'd made the mistake of standing between him and me. Lawrence saw him too. I watched my old partner's face go tight. "Go," Lawrence said quietly. "Take the box, I'll handle this." "Lawrence." "Go, Curtis, now." I went. I took the box with the clone in it and I went out the back and I didn't look back. I heard Lawrence's voice behind me, loud, playing the clown the way he always did when things got dangerous. And then I heard nothing at all, just a soft sound like sand falling. I found out later that Hess had turned him to ash right there in the bar. Lawrence, who'd stolen blueberries off a transport frigate at 14. Lawrence, who taught me how to navigate by the light of Jupiter's moons. A little pile of gray dust on a saloon floor on Ceres. I didn't have time to grieve. Grief is a luxury the system doesn't sell. I had Lawrence's plan in my head and a box humming under my arm, and Hess was behind me somewhere, and the only direction that made sense was forward. I pointed my ship toward Jupiter. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of recycled air and protein paste, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the only conscious mind in a tin can hurtling through nothing. I talked to Lawrence in my head sometimes. Ran the plan over and over the way he'd laid it out, hearing his voice fill in the details. Jupiter, then Venus, then Earth. Simple. He'd have been sitting in the co-pilot's chair, feet up, telling me stories about the time he stole a crate of strawberries from a Martian freighter and got chased halfway to Saturn. He'd have been making the dark feel smaller just by being in it. But the co-pilot's chair was empty, and the dark was exactly as big as it had always been. I checked the clone box every few hours, watching the shape inside it grow more defined through the translucent casing. It was like watching a photograph develop, except the photograph was a person. By day 5, I could see limbs. By day 9, I could see her face, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, skin so new it seemed to glow. By day 11, she was breathing, and I could hear her heartbeat through the box wall, steady and alien in the silence of the ship. I put my hand on the casing and felt the warmth of her, and I thought about what it meant that somewhere out here, past the belt, past everything familiar, we'd figured out how to build a human being in a box. And the first thing we decided to do with that miracle was trade it. A real live girl. The first one born past the belt in God knows how long, and I was going to trade her for a boy who'd seen a breast. The things we do for money. Jupiter's mining colony was everything I expected and worse. A pressurized complex bolted to the surface of Callisto, all gray metal and flickering lights and the constant rumble of drilling rigs working the ice below. The air tasted like iron. The corridors were narrow and low-ceilinged, designed for function, not comfort, and every surface had a patina of grime that no amount of scrubbing would remove. The walls sweated condensation. The ventilation system wheezed like a man with a chest cold. The men who lived there moved in slow herds, their faces blank, their bodies thick with the kind of muscle you get from work rather than exercise. They'd been out here so long that Earth was just a word to them, a story their grandfathers told. They ate in shifts, slept in bunks stacked 4 high, and spent their recreation hours watching the boy. That was their entertainment, their culture, their church. I saw it before I met Vilensky. They had a theater of sorts, a cleared-out storage bay with benches bolted to the floor and a stage made of cargo pallets. The boy stood up there in his ceremonial robes, and the miners sat below him, 300 at a time, watching him with an attention that was more than admiration. It was devotion. He'd tell them what he'd seen, describe it in the same words he'd used 1,000 times before, and they'd listen like it was new, like it was scripture. 3,000 men on a frozen moon, organizing their entire emotional lives around one kid's fatting childhood memory. It would have been funny if it wasn't the saddest thing I'd seen that week. It wouldn't hold that title long. Lee Vilensky ran the operation from a control room at the top of the complex. He was a small man with a big voice and the eyes of an accountant, always calculating, always measuring the distance between what you were offering and what you were worth. He sat behind a desk made from salvaged hull plating and looked at me the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. "Curtis," he said, "I heard you were coming. News travels. Not much else does out here." He leaned back. "What do you have for me?" I put the box on his desk. He opened it. He stared at what was inside for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived, his expression was something other than calculation. It was wonder, raw, stupid, human wonder. The kind of look a man gets when he sees something he'd stopped believing was possible. "She's real," he said. "She's real." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "What do you want for her?" "The boy." Vilensky's expression hardened. The boy who actually saw a woman's breast is the most valuable asset on this colony. The men worship him. He's the only thing keeping morale above the suicide line. I know what he is. I also know what she is. You put a real live woman in front of those miners and the boy becomes yesterday's headline. He knew I was right. We both did. The math was ugly, but it was math. He made the call. 20 minutes later, 2 guards brought the boy into the control room. He was younger than I expected. 18, maybe 19, with a face that hadn't learned how to be hard yet. He wore a costume, something ceremonial, draped and ridiculous, and he carried himself with the bewildered dignity of someone who'd been told his whole life that he was special, but had never been told why in terms that made any sense. He'd seen a woman's breast once, as a child, before his family shipped him to Jupiter. That single moment of contact with the female half of the species had made him a god to 3,000 miners who'd never seen one at all. "You're Curtis," he said. "I'm Curtis. Where are we going?" "Venus." He nodded like that meant something to him. It didn't. He'd never been off Callisto. He'd never been anywhere. But he nodded anyway because that's what you do when you're 18 and someone tells you your life is about to change. You nod and you hope they're not lying. I got him on my ship and we cleared Jupiter's gravity well, and I set a course for Venus, and for about 6 hours, I let myself believe the hard part was over. Then the comm crackled. "Samuel Curtis," Hess's voice thin and precise coming through on an open frequency. "I know where you're going, I know what you're carrying. I wanted you to know that I'm not angry, I just need to see you. I need you to look at me and tell me it's all right, and then I'll kill you. It's only fair." The boy looked at me. Who was that? Nobody, I said. Go strap in. I cut the comm, and I pushed the engines harder, and I started looking for somewhere to hide. The system is mostly empty. People forget that. For all the colonies and stations and mining rigs, space is still space, vast and cold and indifferent. But every now and then you find something in the gaps, something someone left behind. We found it drifting between Jupiter and the inner system. A structure, not a station, a barn. An actual wooden barn, sealed in a pressurized membrane, tumbling slowly through the void. I brought us alongside and matched rotation and docked, and the boy and I went inside, and what we found in there was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. Silver miners. 5 of them, or what was left of them. They'd come from Nevada back when the first wave of prospectors went out past the belt looking for precious metals in the asteroids. That was over 100 years ago. These men had found silver, built this barn in the vacuum to house their operation, and then discovered they couldn't go home. Space atrophy had twisted their bodies, bones thinned, muscles wasted, organs shifted. Earth's gravity would kill them in minutes, so they'd stayed. 100 years, floating in a barn, mining silver nobody came to collect. The oldest of them did most of the talking. He sat in a chair that had been welded to the floor and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly strong for a body that looked like it might come apart in a stiff breeze. His arms were too long. His spine had curved in ways that spines weren't designed to curve. But his mind was sharp, sharper than mine, maybe. Something about the isolation, the zero gravity, the decades of nothing to do but think, had honed their intelligence to a point that was almost unsettling. They'd figured out how to keep the barn pressurized with materials that should have failed decades ago. They'd engineered a water recycling system out of mining equipment. They'd kept themselves alive through pure, stubborn ingenuity, the kind of problem-solving that only happens when the alternative is death and you've decided death can wait. They showed me around the barn like proud homeowners, the sleeping quarters, rigged with netting to keep them from floating into the walls, the workshop where they processed silver they'd never sell, the small garden where they grew something that was technically edible, fed by a light array they'd built from helmet lamps and reflective hull plating. 100 years of making do, 100 years of refusing to die in the dark. They'd adapted, found a way to survive. 2 of them had even managed to have a child, a boy they called Bodysuit, because he'd been raised in a hydraulic exoskeleton that simulated Earth's gravity. The suit pressed against him constantly, kept his bones dense and his muscles strong, so that someday, he could go home to a planet he'd never seen. Bodysuit was maybe 15. He was quiet and strong, and he looked at me with eyes that were too old for his face. The miners asked if I'd take him to Earth, give him the life they'd never have. "What do you want in return?" I asked. "Chocolate," said the oldest miner, "and cigarettes, and your word." My word, that I'd get the boy home, that I'd see him safe to solid ground and real sunlight and air that didn't taste like metal. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for rescue. They knew they were past rescuing. They just wanted to know that something they'd made, someone they'd made, would touch grass and breathe wind and live under a sky that wasn't black. I gave them my word. I gave them the chocolate and cigarettes from my stores. And I took Bodysuit aboard, and I left that barn drifting in the dark, and I didn't look back, because looking back is another luxury the system doesn't sell. 3 passengers now. The boy who actually saw a woman's breast, who didn't understand what was happening. Bodysuit, who understood too well. And me, Samuel Curtis, interplanetary trader, running out of fuel and options with a killer behind me and a promise in front of me. Venus was green. That's the thing nobody tells you. When you break through the cloud layer and the terraformed surface comes into view. It's green, rolling hills and rivers and forests that look like something out of a painting. After months in gray corridors and black vacuum, the color hit me like a fist. The boy pressed himself against the viewport and didn't speak. Bodysuit stood behind him, still in his hydraulic frame, the servos humming softly as he shifted his weight. Neither of them had ever seen anything like it. Neither had I, if I'm honest. Not in a long time. We landed in a clearing near a settlement that looked more like a garden than a town, low buildings made of some local wood, painted white, surrounded by flowering hedges and gravel paths. The air that came through the vents when I cracked the seal was warm and sweet, carrying the scent of something blooming. It was the cleanest air I'd breathed in years. My lungs didn't know what to do with it. The women who lived there had built a civilization that was quiet and ordered and gentle in ways that made the rest of the system look like what it was: a junkyard with aspirations. They moved with an ease that comes from not living in fear, not watching the pressure gauges, not wondering if the next seal failure would be the one that killed everyone. They'd built something that worked, and they'd done it without the men who'd scattered across the system chasing rocks and ore, and whatever else men chase when they forget what home is for. They were waiting for us when we came down the ramp. A delegation, led by a woman named Ceres, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the patience of someone who'd been dealing with men's nonsense for too long. She looked at the boy, then at Bodysuit, then at me. "Which one?" she said. The plan had been to trade the boy. That was Lawrence's plan. Give Venus its new stud king, take Johnny Arse remains, go home. Simple, clean. But Hess was here. I could feel it before I saw the ship, that prickle at the back of the neck, that tightening in the gut. He'd beaten us to Venus. He was somewhere on this planet, waiting, and if I handed over the boy and took Johnny Arse's body and tried to leave, Hess would be between me and the exit. He'd kill the boy just to make a point. He'd kill anyone near me, the way he'd killed Lawrence. Not because they'd done anything to him, but because they'd been close to me, and proximity to Samuel Curtis had become a death sentence. I looked at the boy, 18 years old, a kid dressed up in a costume he didn't choose, given a title he didn't earn, traded like cargo across a solar system that didn't care about him. He'd never asked for any of this. He'd just seen something once as a child, and the men around him had turned that accident into a religion. On the trip from the barn to Venus, he'd started talking to me. Not much, he was a quiet kid, but enough. He told me he couldn't remember what his mother looked like. He told me he'd never eaten fruit. He told me he wanted to see an ocean. I looked at Bodysuit, 15, raised in a hydraulic cage by dying men in a drifting barn, strong enough for Earth's gravity, strong enough for anything. He'd been built for a purpose, not by choice, but by necessity and love, the kind of love that bends metal and welds exoskeletons and keeps a child alive in the void for 15 years on the chance that someday he might walk under an open sky. He didn't know Earth. He didn't know Venus. He knew the barn, and the miners and the hum of his suit, and nothing else. But he was strong, and Venus needed someone strong. "Him," I said, pointing to Bodysuit. "He's your new king." Cloris studied Bodysuit for a long moment. He stood there in his exoskeleton, quiet, solid, meeting her eyes without flinching. Whatever she saw, it was enough. "And the other one?" she asked, looking at the boy. "He's with me. I'm taking him home." It wasn't the plan. Lawrence would have called me an idiot. Lawrence would have said the numbers don't work, that I was throwing away the payday for sentiment, that you can't haul a kid across the solar system on principle when principle doesn't pay for fuel. But Lawrence was a pile of ash on Ceres, and his plan died with him, and I was standing on Venus making decisions with my gut instead of my head, because my head hadn't kept anyone alive so far. Cloris gave me Johnny Arse remains. She gave them freely, without a trade, because I'd brought her Bodysuit and because, I think, she understood something about what I was doing that I didn't fully understand myself. She had the body prepared in a sealed container, and her people loaded it onto my ship, and she looked at me one last time with an expression I couldn't read. "You should leave quickly," she said. "There's a man here, arrived yesterday. He's been asking about you." "Hess." I got the boy on the ship. I got Johnny Arse's container secured in the hold. I fired the engines and we broke atmosphere, and I pointed us toward Earth, and I pushed the throttle to the stops, and I waited for the comm to crackle. It didn't, not right away. The silence lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of the boy sleeping in the co-pilot's chair and me watching the scanner and listening to the hum of the engines and thinking about Lawrence and bodysuit and the miners in their barn and all the little piles of ash that Professor Hess had left scattered across the system like punctuation marks in a sentence I couldn't parse. Then the comm came alive. "Samuel." His voice was different now, quieter. The sharp edge was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded almost like exhaustion, like a man who'd been running for so long he'd forgotten what he was running toward. "I'm not going to chase you anymore," Hess said. "I wanted to tell you that I stayed on Venus. The women here, they let me stay. They don't know what I am, or maybe they do and they don't care. Women are strange that way, stronger than us maybe. They see the damage and they don't run from it, they just make room." A pause. Static. The hiss of distance between two ships, between two lives that had been tangled together by whatever accident of history had made us friends and then made us enemies. "I'm going to help raise the boy, bodysuit. I'm going to raise him like a son." Another pause, then quieter still. "I was hoping he'd grow into a fine young man, someone I could." A long silence. I could hear him breathing. "But sons rarely live up to their father's expectations. Isn't that right, Samuel?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. Hess had killed Lawrence. He'd killed God knows how many others. He'd chased me across the system with a weapon that turned people to dust, driven by a need I never understood, some twisted hunger for forgiveness, for absolution, for a version of our shared past that I couldn't give him because I didn't know what he thought I'd done. And now he was on Venus, playing father to a boy in a hydraulic suit, surrounded by women who had no idea what he was. I turned off the comm. I watched the stars. After a while, the boy woke up and sat beside me and looked out at the dark. "Where are we going?" he asked. Same question, same quiet voice. "Earth," I said. "What's it like?" I thought about that. I hadn't been to Earth in a long time. Years. The system had a way of keeping you out here once you started, one more job, one more haul, one more trade. You told yourself you were earning your way home, but the truth was that home was just another word you carried in your pocket, wearing smooth from handling. "It's heavy," I said. "The gravity, you feel it in your knees, your shoulders. The air is thick and it smells like dirt and water and living things. The sky changes color, blue to orange to black, and there's weather, real weather, rain that falls from clouds, wind that moves through trees." The boy was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'd like to see a tree." "You will." We flew in silence after that. The scanner stayed clean. No pursuit. No Hess. Just the long dark between Venus and home, measured in hours and engine hum, and the breathing of a kid who'd spent his whole life being a symbol and was about to become just a person. I thought about the miners in their barn, floating somewhere behind us. I thought about the chocolate and cigarettes I'd left them, and how those small things, sweetness and smoke, were probably the last kindnesses they'd ever receive from the world that forgot them. I thought about the word I'd given them, and how bodysuit was on Venus now instead of Earth, and whether that meant I'd broken my promise or just bent it in a direction none of us had planned for. I thought about Lawrence, how he'd stayed behind in that saloon so I could run, how the last thing he did was play the fool, because playing the fool had always been his best trick, the one that bought time when time was the only currency worth having. I thought about Hess, and I tried to feel something simple, hatred or pity or relief, but what I felt was just tired. Hess was what the system made of a man when there was nothing left to hold him together. No gravity, no ground, no one to tell him he was wrong, just an obsession and a weapon and a birthday nobody remembered. The boy slept. I watched the instruments. Earth grew in the viewport, blue and white and impossibly alive, like a heartbeat in the chest of something vast and cold. Johnny R's body was in the hold. A man who'd spent his life as stud king of Venus, servicing a civilization of women who needed him for biology and nothing else. He died in service, and his family wanted him back, and the reward they were offering was enough to set me up for years. Enough to stop hauling. Enough to stop trading people like cargo across a system that had forgotten what people were for. I'd lost Lawrence. I'd given away bodysuit. I'd broken the plan in half and taped it back together with spit and stubbornness. And I was coming home with a dead man's bones and a living boy and nothing else to show for it except the fact that I was still breathing, which, in this system, counted as a victory. The boy woke up when we hit the outer atmosphere. He felt the ship shudder as gravity took hold, and he gripped the armrests, and his eyes went wide. "Is that it?" he said. "Is that the weight?" "That's it." He looked scared. Then he looked something else, something I hadn't seen on his face before. Eager, like a man taking a breath after being underwater too long. "It's a lot," he said. "You get used to it." We came down through cloud cover over the Atlantic. The boy pressed his face to the viewport and watched the ocean appear below us, gray and silver and stretching to the horizon, and he made a sound, quiet, involuntary, that was the sound of a man seeing something real for the first time. Not a projection, not a story. The actual world spread out beneath him, heavy and wet and alive. I watched the clouds break apart as we descended, saw rain falling in sheets over a coastline that was more green than gray, and I felt the ship shoulder into the atmosphere like a tired horse coming home to the barn. I landed at a port outside of what used to be Baltimore. The landing struts hit concrete and the ship settled with a groan, and for a moment everything was still. No engine hum, no recycled air, just the tick of cooling metal and the sound of wind outside the hull, actual wind, moving actual air across actual ground. The air came in when I cracked the hatch, warm, humid, smelling of salt and rust and green things growing. It was overwhelming. After months of filtered, recycled, processed air, the sheer density of it, the pollen, the moisture, the organic stink of a living planet hit like walking into a wall. I stood in the hatchway and breathed it and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for so long I'd stopped noticing. The boy stood at the top of the ramp and looked out at the sky, which was the color of a bruise fading to yellow at the edges, and he didn't move for a long time. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the weight, from the gravity that was pressing him down into his own bones, telling every cell in his body that he was home, that this was where humans were meant to stand. "That's a tree," I said, pointing to the line of oaks along the perimeter fence. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. Then he walked down the ramp, slow and careful, feeling the gravity in every step, and he crossed the tarmac to the tree and he put his hand on the bark and he stood there, touching it, not saying anything. I let him have that moment. I owed him that much. Johnny R's family came for the body the next day. They were quiet, wealthy people who didn't ask questions about where their son had been or what he'd done or why he'd gone to Venus in the first place. They opened the container, looked at what was inside, closed it, and handed me a credit transfer that made my eyes water. Then they were gone, and Johnny R was gone, and the hold was empty. The boy stayed. I hadn't planned on that either. I hadn't planned on any of it. But he had nowhere to go, and I had a ship that was too quiet with just one person in it, and he needed someone to show him how Earth worked, how to buy food, how to walk in gravity, how to talk to people who didn't worship him for something he half remembered from childhood. So he stayed. I told people he was my son when they asked, because it was easier than the truth, and because the truth was so strange that nobody would have believed it anyway. The boy who saw a breast, raised as royalty on a mining colony, traded across the solar system like a sack of ore, and delivered to Earth by a man who'd lost his best friend and broken every deal he'd made along the way. I think about Hess sometimes. Out there on Venus in that green world, raising bodysuit in a house full of women who don't know what he's done. I think about whether bodysuit will grow up strong, whether the suit did its job, whether he'll learn to walk without the hydraulics. I think about whether Hess will ever find what he's looking for, that forgiveness, that absolution, or whether he'll just keep waiting for a son to disappoint him, the way sons do. I think about Lawrence most of all, the pile of ash on the floor of Eddie's bar, the way he said go without hesitating, without calculating, without weighing his life against the plan. He just did it, pushed me out the door and turned to face the thing that was going to kill him, and probably made a joke while it happened, because that was Lawrence. That was the human thing to do, not the smart thing, not the profitable thing, the human thing. The system is still out there. The mines on Jupiter, the women on Venus, the barns drifting in the dark with their dying miners and their impossible children. The traders and the thieves and the derelicts, all of them hauling their cargo from one rock to another, making deals, breaking deals, surviving. It's not pretty. It's not noble. It's just what we do. We keep moving. We keep making promises we can't keep and then killing ourselves to keep them anyway. We carry other people's children to places we've never been and call it a living. I don't fly anymore. My knees can't take the launches, and my ship needs a new engine I can't afford and don't want to buy. The boy, I should stop calling him that. He has a name now, one he picked for himself, though I'll keep it between us. The boy works at the port, loading cargo, building a life out of the raw material of a world he's still learning. He's good at it. He's good at being ordinary, which is the hardest thing in the universe when you've spent your whole life being told you're extraordinary for something you barely remember. Last night he came home smelling like rain. He stood in the doorway and he said, "It rained today." I said, "I know." He said, "I stood in it." And he smiled, not the ceremonial smile he'd worn on Jupiter, the one they'd taught him, a real one. The kind that starts in the gut and works its way up to the face and doesn't ask for anything in return. I looked at that smile and I thought about Lawrence, and the miners, and the barn, and the ash, and the long dark between the planets. I thought about every deal I'd made and every deal I'd broken, and every person I'd carried in my hold like freight. And I thought, this is what we do. This is the human thing. We haul each other home.